Let me begin my welcoming remarks by paying tribute to the memory of a good stalwart of African, Caribbean, and Jamaican advocacy who transitioned while working assiduously on this colloquium, Professor the Honorable Ambassador Richard Bernal, a true son and scholar of Jamaica and Africa. Brothers and sisters, friends, global studies in Latin America and the Caribbean is seldom known or taught as a regular subject in our school systems or even in informal settings. So many of us do not realize that the near 8 billion humans who inhabit planet Earth all trace their ancestry back to Africa. That continent was the home to the first human beings. What is known and taught in the educational curriculum on this side of the pond is mostly distilled through Eurocentric lenses of plantation slavery, racism, and colonialism. Africans know very little about their kith and kin in other parts of the world. Her children, resident in other parts of the world, know very little about the historical greatness and exploits of Africa, which led to the evolution of the world over hundreds of thousands of years ago. Very few in the Americas and in Africa know that Africans were purveyors of science, technology, civilization, and development in Europe, the Americas, and Asia, long before Europe knew there were other continents and other human beings beyond their space. At one time, they even thought that the earth was flat and that if you went far enough, you would fall off into an abyss. In ignorance, they thought they were in India when they reached the Caribbean, and that is why we came to be known as the West Indies. By the deliberate efforts of Europe in modern times, the knowledge of ancient African civilizations and African contributions to science, technology, navigation, and history have been efficiently and effectively excluded from the curriculum at all segments of formal educational systems and learning in global Africa and the African diaspora. To this end, it becomes imperative that people of African descent complete and take ownership of their own education, share the narratives that reflect our ancestry, and speak to a wholesome, united future for progress. In 1964, UNESCO launched an elaborate project aimed at writing the general history of Africa. The challenge, as UNESCO saw it then, consisted of reconstructing Africa's history, freeing it from racial prejudices ensuing from slave trade and colonization, and promoting an African perspective. That task was necessary, but the most critical challenge facing global Africa is how to emancipate ourselves from mental slavery and remove the depiction of black and blackness as signifying backwardness and primitivism. While Jamaica may be geographically and demographically small, as we say here, we little but we tallow. Our island and other Caribbean nations were right there in the thick of the struggle for the dismantling of apartheid as a member of the non-aligned nations, in the formation and carriage of the ACP group and other multilateral communities which bonded together to ensure that the dignity of global Africa was restored and the continent finally freed of colonization and apartheid. Being aware that the struggle is not yet over, global Africa must now take ownership of the narrative, the knowledge and education of its youth, so that the resources and wealth of Africa can be used to benefit global Africa. Herein lies the primary responsibility of African Union, CARICOM, and other intergovernmental agencies. Africa must bring together her descendants and build bridges through truthful and honest conversations. That mission demands the urgency of now. That the children of Africa survived and thrived in the Americas is a function of the innate resilience of our ancestors. The triumph of the descendants of Africa over all the European powers to create the first republic in the Western Hemisphere, Haiti, was not a mean achievement, even though this victory was betrayed by the collusion of the defeated European nations to levy a charge on the victorious victim. A first in human history where the victor and victim is made to pay reparations to the defeated aggressor. The effect of the hundreds of years of destabilizing terrorism which the Atlantic slave trade wrought on the various communities of the Gulf of Guinea and West Central Africa is yet to be calculated for adequate compensation by the Europeans. Africa lost several entire generations of its sons and daughters, thereby stultifying the growth and development of the continental homeland. We need research and learning so that global Africa can with one voice proclaim never again and justify our claim. The P.J. Patterson Institute of Africa-Caribbean Advocacy was established by a decision of the University of the West Indies Council as part of its global outreach in its recognition of the importance of intellectual ownership of knowledge creation, documentation, and dissemination. This colloquium fits snugly within the objectives of the Institute. We aim to assist in developing the framework for the coordination of public advocacy and development partnering between the Caribbean and Africa. To provide a framework which enables leaders and academics from Africa, the Caribbean, and the diaspora to engage in a strategy to provide public advocacy around major issues affecting both regions. To promote, encourage, facilitate a fertile exchange of cultural groups, artists, scholars, entertainers, athletes, sports persons, to build the ties between Africa, the Caribbean, and our diaspora. To support the quest for reparative justice, the fight against racism and discrimination, so as to achieve economic and social empowerment for people of color everywhere. To assist the governments and institutions of Africa and the Caribbean in the design and establishment of a new world order, so as to promote the interests and security of developing countries in global governance, economic growth, trade, technology, health, culture, and climate change. Successful advocacy must flow from the rich fountain of knowledge, and so our institute regards the exchange of academic wisdom as essential to its work. This colloquium is fully supported by our institute because it speaks to the utilization of knowledge to cement the bonds of family between continental Africa and diaspora Africa. We applaud the purpose of this colloquium in bringing together scholars, researchers, and policymakers to deliberate and engage global African studies in an intercross and multidisciplinary manner. We anticipate the outcome will bring in one coherent framework the historical, cultural, economic, scientific, and religious networks of the African continent, explore the expansion of trade between Africa and Europe, North and South America, the Middle East, and Asia, speak to the modern African diaspora generated by the forced and unforced migration of African slaves and migrants, now facing the changing processes of globalization. It must aim to span the different religions of Africa and those within the African diaspora. These interdisciplinary, cross and multidisciplinary studies cover the world and therefore deserve to be known as global African studies. That will include the studies of migrants from Africa, the Caribbean, and Latin America, especially to Western Europe, within Latin America, and to the USA and Canada. The studies must become historical rather than historical because they must encompass contemporary immigration and reparation challenges facing global Africa. As we know too well, much of the early research and studies on Africa was done by Europeans who created westernized frameworks for the understanding of the continent's historic, religious, social, intellectual, scientific, aesthetic, and cultural issues and challenges. Since then, there have been several initiatives by Africans and persons of African descent globally to relate our own stories and narratives. Institutes of African Studies were launched when most African countries were becoming independent as an attempt to recover lost ground. The areas of study subsequently broadened into philosophical, social, political, religious, economic, cultural, and aesthetic issues. Latin American countries have largely remained behind in these developments, with the possible exceptions of Brazil and Cuba. And attempts to institutionalize these issues within universities and research institutions have been stunted for lack of adequate resources. There's a compelling need to create viable and sustainable platforms for academics, policymakers, administrators, and African descendants generally in Latin America and the Caribbean to discuss and plan structured institutional approaches to establishing, increasing, and enhancing rigorous multi- and interdisciplinary global African studies programs in all these regions. Over the coming days, I am sure participants will have intellectually stimulating and productive interactions on various aspects of global African studies in Latin America and the Caribbean. It is my fervent belief that the beneficial effects of the colloquium will continue to inspire creative policy perspectives that will enrich the linkages between Africa and her diaspora as one large, united, and cohesive family. I want to take this opportunity to congratulate the organizers of this important colloquium for a job well done under strenuous circumstances, and to thank the participants from all continents of the world for taking part in our discussions. It is my great pleasure to participate in the opening of this formidable gathering of learned and distinguished professors and scholars. I wish you fruitful deliberations. One love.